Before Caitlin Clark ever played a single minute in the WNBA, before sold-out arenas, before record-breaking TV numbers, before the league even knew how to handle the attention, she had already won. Not on the scoreboard, not in the standings, but in a place most athletes never even think to look: corporate America. While other players were fighting for minutes, rankings, and respect, Caitlin Clark was quietly becoming the most valuable marketing asset women's basketball had ever produced. And the wild part? She didn't have a championship ring. She didn't have a pro resume. She didn't even have a WNBA jersey yet. Still, the biggest brands in the world weren't waiting. They were circling. Nike, State Farm, Wilson, Gatorade, companies that usually move slow, companies that hate risk, companies that don't gamble millions on potential. And yet, they all made the same decision at the same time. They bet on her before the league did. That alone should make you pause. Because brands don't do favors. They don't hand out opportunities. And they definitely don't break decades-old rules unless they see something everyone else missed. So how did a college player from Iowa force billion-dollar companies to rewrite their own playbooks? Why did advertisers trust her authenticity more than polished superstars with years of professional experience? And what did Caitlin Clark understand about influence, connection, and culture that the rest of the basketball world was still trying to figure out? Because this story isn't about a genius commercial. It's about how one athlete cornered the market on belief and made the entire sports industry adjust to her instead of the other way around. And the truth is, this didn't start with Nike. It didn't start with State Farm. It didn't even start in college. It started much earlier, in a place most people overlook completely. Caitlin Clark's real advantage was never her shooting range. It was never the logo threes. It was never the highlight reels that made defenders look helpless. Those came later. What set her apart from the beginning was something far less flashy and far more powerful. She never tried to become marketable. From the moment people started paying attention to her, Caitlin Clark didn't look like an athlete being shaped for cameras. She didn't talk like someone coached by PR teams. She didn't move like someone rehearsing a brand image. She just existed. A kid from Iowa, playing the game the way she loved it, talking about her dreams without polishing them into sound bites. And that's where everyone else miscalculated. Because while most young athletes are trained to chase approval, to fit into the mold sponsors already understand, Caitlin Clark did the opposite. She didn't adapt to the system. She let the system try to catch up to her. She grew up in Des Moines, not a media capital, not a basketball factory, not a place where stars are manufactured. There was no pipeline, no blueprint, no expectation that a girl from Iowa would redefine how women's basketball was marketed on a national level. In fact, early on, she didn't even have the luxury of playing against girls her own age. If she wanted competition, she had to play with the boys. And that mattered more than people realize. Because when you grow up in environments where you're constantly told, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, that you don't quite belong, you develop something different. You stop playing for validation. You stop asking permission. You stop waiting to be chosen. You start building certainty. That certainty showed up in the way she played. Pull-up threes from distances coaches warned players never to attempt. Shots that looked reckless to everyone else, until they kept going in. But it also showed up in how she talked about herself. She didn't describe her journey as grinding or staying humble the way athletes are expected to. She talked openly about dreaming big, about wanting more, about knowing exactly where she was headed. And in a sports culture that still feels uncomfortable with confident women, that alone was disruptive. Most athletes are taught to downplay ambition. Caitlin Clark leaned into it. She talked about missing prom and not caring. She talked about sacrifice without turning it into a pity story. She talked about believing in herself without waiting for permission to do so. And none of it felt manufactured. That's the part brands noticed. Because there's a massive difference between an athlete saying the right things and an athlete being the right thing. Caitlin wasn't performing relatability. She was relatable by accident. She didn't frame herself as a superhero. She didn't frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as someone who wanted something badly and was willing to give up everything else to get it. That story works everywhere. It works for kids shooting alone in empty gyms. It works for parents watching from the stands. It works for people who have never touched a basketball in their lives, but know what it feels like to chase something bigger than themselves. And here's what most people missed at the time. Caitlin Clark wasn't just building a fan base. She was building emotional equity. While other athletes were stacking stats, she was stacking trust. While others were chasing exposure, she was creating familiarity. Fans didn't feel like they were watching a star. They felt like they were watching someone they already knew. And that's marketing gold. Because brands don't actually sell products. They sell alignment. They sell identity. They sell the feeling that this person represents who you want to be. Caitlin Clark didn't need to be positioned that way. She already was. By the time major companies started paying attention, she wasn't just a great player. She was a symbol of ambition, confidence, sacrifice, and belief, wrapped in a personality that didn't feel rehearsed or distant. She didn't chase the spotlight. The spotlight followed her. And that's why what happened next shocked the entire industry. Because the first company to move didn't come from sneakers, or sports drinks, or basketball equipment. It came from a place no one expected to lead the revolution. And when that domino fell, everything changed. When State Farm made the first move, the sports world didn't celebrate it. They questioned it. Because from the outside, it looked irresponsible. At the time, Caitlin Clark hadn't played a single professional game. The WNBA hadn't drafted her yet. She hadn't proven anything on the highest level. And the NIL era was still brand new, messy, untested, and full of uncertainty. Most companies were terrified. NIL had just cracked open a door that had been locked for decades, and nobody knew what was on the other side. Executives worried about backlash, about wasted money, about hitching their brand to an athlete who might flame out, get injured, or simply fail to live up to the hype. So brands did what corporations always do when they're scared. They played it safe. Small deals, regional campaigns, social media posts instead of national TV. Short-term contracts they could quietly walk away from. Nobody wanted to be the first to go all in, except State Farm, an insurance company, not a sneaker giant, not a sportswear brand, not a lifestyle label, looked at the chaos and saw opportunity. While others hesitated, State Farm made a decision that stunned the entire marketing industry. They didn't just sign Caitlin Clark. They put her on national television. This wasn't a throwaway appearance. This wasn't a niche digital ad. This wasn't a women's basketball-only campaign. State Farm placed her in the same commercial universe as established stars, veteran athletes, and household names. She became the first college athlete, male or female, to appear in a national State Farm commercial. Think about what that actually means. State Farm had been running athlete-driven campaigns for decades. They had access to Super Bowl champions, MVPs, Hall of Famers. They could choose certainty. They could choose safety. Instead, they chose a college player from Iowa. To traditional marketers, that sounded insane. She hadn't won a national title. She hadn't proven longevity. She wasn't even technically a professional. From a risk management perspective, it made no sense. But that's because most people were still evaluating Caitlin Clark like an athlete. State Farm evaluated her like a story. They didn't ask, has she accomplished enough yet? They asked, do people already care? And the answer was obvious. Her games were pulling massive ratings. Her highlights were dominating social feeds. Her name alone sparked debate, excitement, and loyalty. She wasn't just being watched. She was being followed. And State Farm understood something critical that others missed. In modern marketing, attention is the rarest resource. Talent helps, but it doesn't guarantee connection. Championships don't automatically translate to trust. And star power doesn't always convert into influence. Caitlin Clark had something far more valuable. People believed her. So instead of forcing her into a traditional athlete script, State Farm did something incredibly smart. They didn't turn her into a spokesperson. They let her be herself. Most athlete commercials feel stiff for a reason. Players are coached through every line. Every movement is planned. Every joke is rehearsed until it feels lifeless. Caitlin Clark didn't act. She reacted. Her delivery was dry. Her timing felt instinctive. Her expressions weren't exaggerated. She didn't look like someone trying to sell you something. She looked like someone who just happened to be holding a camera's attention. And the audience noticed immediately. The commercials didn't feel like advertisements. They felt like moments. The kind people replay. The kind people quote. The kind people recognize within seconds. Then something happened that no marketing department can manufacture. The catchphrase took off. Not because it was pushed. Not because it was paid. But because fans adopted it. Kids started repeating it in pickup games. Creators used it in edits. Fans referenced it online without being prompted. State Farm didn't just run a campaign. They accidentally created a piece of culture. And that's when the tone around Caitlin Clark changed. She stopped being the talented college player. She stopped being the next big thing. She became a marketing anomaly. Executives across the industry started asking the same question. How did an insurance company beat us to this? Because while everyone else was still debating whether women's basketball was worth the investment, State Farm was already cashing in on something far bigger than gender, leagues, or categories. They were cashing in on relevance. The commercial worked because it didn't feel like a risk to viewers, even if it felt like one on paper. Caitlin Clark didn't need to prove herself in the ad. She already had. That was the moment marketing departments realized they weren't dealing with a normal athlete. They were dealing with someone who could turn a 30-second spot into a long-term relationship. Someone who didn't just represent a brand, but elevated it. And once that realization set in, hesitation disappeared. Because if State Farm could do it and win, everyone else knew what came next. The floodgates were opening. And the biggest brand of them all was already watching closely. Nike didn't see a gamble. They saw a signal. And what they did next would shock even the most seasoned marketing veterans. State Farm's campaign didn't just succeed. It exposed something uncomfortable. Because the real shock wasn't that the commercial worked, it was how it worked. There was no massive ad blitz. No forced virality. No influencer army pushing talking points. The momentum came from the audience. Clips started circulating on social media without State Farm's logo even attached. People weren't sharing it because they loved insurance. They were sharing it because they liked her. That distinction matters. Marketing executives track everything. Engagement rates, share velocity, comment sentiment, audience replication. And Caitlin Clark's numbers didn't behave like a normal athlete endorsement. They behaved like a cultural object. Fans weren't just watching. They were participating. They quoted her lines. They mimicked her expressions. They used her moments as shorthand in basketball conversations. That's the holy grail brands chase and almost never catch. Because there's a massive difference between paid attention and chosen attention. Paid attention disappears the moment the budget stops. Chosen attention multiplies on its own. And Caitlin Clark was generating chosen attention at scale. That's when executives started panicking, quietly. Because the traditional marketing playbook had no explanation for what they were seeing. According to the old rules, this shouldn't have worked. She wasn't loud. She wasn't polarizing. She wasn't selling controversy. She was just real. And that authenticity was spreading faster than anything money could buy. This created a new problem for brands. If Caitlin Clark could dominate attention without professional credentials, what did that say about how they had been evaluating athletes for decades? They realized something unsettling. They had been overvaluing accomplishments and undervaluing connection. Caitlin Clark didn't feel distant. She didn't feel untouchable. She didn't feel corporate. Fans didn't see her as a billboard. They saw her as an extension of themselves. And once that emotional bridge forms, it's almost impossible to break. Brands began scrambling behind the scenes. Internal meetings shifted tone. Conversations changed from, is she worth the risk, to what happens if we wait too long? Because waiting had suddenly become the biggest danger. If Caitlin Clark signed with one brand, competitors couldn't just replace her with someone else. She wasn't interchangeable. She wasn't a slot to be filled. She was a movement forming in real time. And movements don't wait. That's when the conversation turned serious. This wasn't about one successful commercial. This was about market capture. The first brand to lock her in wouldn't just get exposure. They'd get loyalty, identity, cultural alignment that compounds over time. And then someone pointed out the obvious. If an insurance company could see this, what was Nike waiting for? Because Nike doesn't chase moments. Nike creates eras. They don't move quickly. They move deliberately. They observe patterns years before they surface publicly. And when they act, it's never accidental. Nike had stayed away from the Super Bowl for nearly 3 decades. They didn't need it. They had built their brand on dominance, legacy, and long-term cultural storytelling. So when word started spreading inside the industry that Nike was watching Caitlin Clark closely, people didn't believe it at first. Why would they? She hadn't played professionally. She hadn't been tested at the highest level. She wasn't a global icon yet. And yet, the data was undeniable. Her presence moved people. Her story lingered. Her moment stuck. Nike didn't see a player. They saw momentum. And momentum is the one thing you can't buy once it's gone. So they made a decision that stunned everyone watching. They broke a 27-year silence on the biggest advertising stage in the world. For a 22-year-old who hadn't played a single pro game. And that decision changed everything. For 27 years, Nike stayed away from the Super Bowl. Not because they couldn't afford it. Not because they lacked star power. But because they didn't need it. Nike had built an empire by choosing its moments carefully. The Super Bowl wasn't just an ad slot, it was a declaration. A public statement that said, this matters enough to risk everything. 30 seconds. Tens of millions of dollars. The most distracted audience on earth. Most brands enter that arena hoping to be remembered. Nike only enters when they're ready to define the moment. That's why when Nike decided to return after nearly 3 decades of silence, the industry held its breath. Every assumption pointed toward the same outcome. A global superstar. A proven champion. A safe, familiar face with decades of success. Someone who couldn't fail. Instead, Nike did something that made marketing executives stare at their screens in disbelief. They chose Caitlin Clark, a 22-year-old. No professional games played. No championship parade. No guarantee. From a distance, it looked reckless. From Nike's perspective, it was inevitable. Because Nike wasn't buying accomplishments. They were buying gravity. The Super Bowl isn't won by spectacle anymore. It's overcrowded. Explosions blur together. Celebrity cameos cancel each other out. Most ads vanish from memory before the next play even starts. Nike understood that noise no longer cuts through noise. Silence does. Emotion does. Truth does. So instead of building a flashy, overproduced commercial, Nike stripped everything down. No distractions. No gimmicks. No artificial hype. Just Caitlin Clark. Her voice. Her story. Her sacrifices. She talked about missing prom. She talked about choosing the gym over the dance floor. She talked about wanting something badly enough to give everything else up. And suddenly, millions of people weren't watching a basketball player. They were watching themselves. That's the genius of the ad, and the reason it worked. It didn't try to convince viewers that Caitlin Clark was special. It reminded them of what it feels like to care about something deeply. Nike trusted her authenticity so completely that they didn't shape it. They framed it. They understood something crucial. If you overdirect Caitlin Clark, you weaken her. If you let her speak, she pulls people in. The ad didn't scream greatness. It whispered purpose. And in the middle of the loudest night in advertising, that whisper cut through everything. Within hours, the reaction was overwhelming. People weren't dissecting visuals. They weren't debating production value. They were quoting her words, sharing clips, talking about how the commercial made them feel. Nike had done the impossible. They made a Super Bowl ad feel intimate. That's when the narrative shifted permanently. Caitlin Clark wasn't just a marketing success story anymore. She was a strategic cornerstone. Nike's choice sent a message that echoed far beyond women's basketball. They were signaling to every brand in America that the future wasn't about waiting for athletes to prove themselves at the highest level. The future was about recognizing cultural pull before everyone else does. And Nike had just put their entire reputation behind that belief. But as bold as that move was, it still wasn't the most disruptive partnership Caitlin Clark would sign, because the next company didn't want her image. They wanted her routine. And what happened after that shocked even Nike. Up to this point, Caitlin Clark's rise in advertising still fit, loosely, inside a familiar framework. Athlete signs deal. Athlete appears in commercial. Audience responds. That's how it usually works. Gatorade didn't want that. They weren't interested in another face holding a bottle. They weren't looking for another slogan paired with sweat and slow-motion highlights. And they definitely weren't trying to copy what Nike or State Farm had already done. Gatorade saw something different. They saw that Caitlin Clark didn't just influence attention. She influenced behavior. Fans didn't just watch her. They studied her. They imitated her habits. What she wore mattered. How she trained mattered. What she drank during workouts mattered. And that changed everything. Instead of asking, how do we put Caitlin Clark on our product? Gatorade asked, what if the product comes from Caitlin Clark? That single question flipped the power dynamic. This wasn't an endorsement. It was a collaboration rooted in real life. Gatorade worked with her team to design a hydration and recovery bottle built around her actual training routines. Not a generic template. not a repurposed mold with her name stamped on the side. A product engineered to reflect how she prepares, performs, and recovers. That decision carried risk. If the product didn't sell, it wouldn't just be a failed campaign. It would signal that Caitlin Clark's influence had limits. That fans were only interested in highlights, not habits. Gatorade didn't flinch, because they understood something brands rarely admit out loud. Modern fans don't want to be advertised to. They want access. They want to feel closer to excellence. They want tools, not slogans. They want authenticity they can hold in their hands. And Caitlin Clark's audience was perfectly primed for that. When the bottle launched, it didn't linger on shelves. It didn't need time to build awareness. It sold out almost immediately. Days. Not weeks. Not months. Days. The reaction wasn't driven by hype. It was driven by trust. Fans weren't buying plastic. They were buying proximity. They believed that if this bottle reflected how Caitlin Clark trained, then using it brought them one step closer to her discipline, her routine, her mindset. That's an entirely different relationship between athlete and consumer, and it terrified competitors. Because once a brand crosses that line, once an athlete becomes a source of process instead of promotion, the connection deepens exponentially. You can replace a spokesperson. You can't replace a system. Gatorade understood that Caitlin Clark wasn't valuable because she was visible. She was valuable because she was consistent. Her story lined up with her habits. Her habits lined up with her performance. Her performance reinforced her story. Everything connected. There was no gap for skepticism to slip through. And that's why the product worked. It didn't feel like merch. It felt like insight. And that forced the rest of the industry to confront a new reality. The old endorsement model was dying. Athletes weren't just selling brands anymore. They were becoming brands themselves. But even that wasn't the most radical shift Caitlin Clark would force. Because the next deal didn't just give her influence. It gave her control. And no female athlete had ever been trusted with that level of power before. By the time Wilson entered the picture, Caitlin Clark was no longer just an athlete brands wanted to be associated with. She was a variable they couldn't ignore. Wilson wasn't some newcomer trying to ride a trend. This was the company that had been manufacturing basketballs longer than most players had been alive. The official ball of the NBA. The official ball of the WNBA. A brand built on tradition, authority, and consistency. They didn't need buzz. What they needed was relevance that didn't feel forced. And when they looked at Caitlin Clark, they didn't see a spokesperson. They saw a basketball mind. That distinction changed everything. Wilson didn't approach her with a script and a smile. They didn't ask her to pose next to a product and recite a tagline. They didn't treat her like a marketing accessory. They asked her to help build. They made her the first female athlete in history to co-design a Wilson signature collection. Not endorse. Not promote. Co-create. That word carries weight. Endorsements are about association. Co-creation is about trust. It means giving up control. It means letting someone shape your product instead of just representing it. And Wilson did something almost unheard of in sports manufacturing. They acknowledged that Caitlin Clark understood the game well enough to make their product better. That's not symbolic. That's structural. For decades, athletes, especially female athletes, had been treated as faces, not thinkers. As billboards, not architects. Wilson broke that pattern publicly. And the industry noticed. This wasn't a feel-good gesture. It was a business decision. Wilson believed that Caitlin Clark's perspective, her relationship with the ball, her understanding of rhythm, grip, repetition, and feel could translate into better equipment. They trusted her with the soul of the game. And the way they introduced the collaboration said everything. The commercial wasn't loud. It wasn't crowded. It wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. It was quiet. An empty gym. Footsteps on hardwood. The echo of a ball bouncing in space. No rush. No spectacle. Just repetition. The kind that happens when no one is watching. The ad didn't sell performance. It sold devotion. It captured something most basketball fans recognize instantly. That meditative state where time disappears and the game becomes personal. Caitlin Clark wasn't framed as a celebrity. She was framed as a guardian of the game's purity. And that positioning was deliberate. Wilson wasn't saying, "She uses our ball." They were saying, "She understands why this game matters." That's a powerful message. Because Caitlin Clark's popularity has never been built on dominance alone. It's built on love. She plays with joy. She reacts emotionally. She competes like every possession matters, not because it's her job, but because it's her identity. Fans feel that. They always have. When Wilson made her a co-creator, they weren't just elevating her status. They were validating something fans already believed. That she doesn't just represent basketball. She embodies it. And that emotional truth did more for Wilson than any traditional endorsement ever could. The collaboration didn't feel like a campaign. It felt like a statement about the future of the sport. A future where athletes, especially women, aren't just marketing assets, but intellectual partners. And once that door opens, it doesn't close quietly. Because when you zoom out and look at Caitlin Clark's deals together, a pattern emerges that most people still miss. This wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It wasn't hype. It was something far rarer. She possessed three qualities brands spend billions trying to manufacture, and almost never succeed. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. By now, the surface-level explanation had collapsed. Caitlin Clark wasn't landing these deals because she checked boxes. She wasn't benefiting from a trend. She wasn't being pushed by some behind-the-scenes machine. There was something structural happening. When brands tried to reverse-engineer her success, they kept running into the same problem. They couldn't recreate it. You can copy a campaign. You can mimic an aesthetic. You can even imitate a tone. But you cannot manufacture what Caitlin Clark naturally possesses. And when you strip away the headlines, the contracts, the commercials, and the hype, everything comes back to three traits. Three rare elements that almost never exist in the same athlete at the same time. This is where the real advantage lives. Trait 1, natural camera gravity. Most athletes are trained for the camera. They're coached on posture, on facial expressions, on how to sound relatable without saying anything real. Caitlin Clark doesn't do any of that. She doesn't perform comfort. She doesn't chase likability. She doesn't over-explain herself. She simply shows up, and the camera follows. There's a difference between presence and performance, and audiences feel it immediately. With Caitlin Clark, nothing feels forced. Her pauses feel intentional even when they aren't. Her reactions land because they're genuine, not rehearsed. She knows when to let a moment breathe. She knows when to say nothing. She knows when a look communicates more than a sentence ever could. That instinct can't be taught. Most athletes have to be guided through every beat of a shoot. Caitlin Clark doesn't need direction. She needs space. And the less interference there is, the stronger the result becomes. That's why her commercials feel effortless. They don't feel produced. They feel observed. And in an era where audiences are hyper-aware of manipulation, that authenticity cuts straight through the noise. Stats don't move culture. Stories do. Caitlin Clark's story works because it isn't about basketball. Basketball is just the setting. Her journey is about wanting something deeply, about choosing discipline over comfort, about sacrificing moments other people take for granted in pursuit of a bigger vision. Missing prom, early mornings, empty gyms, uncelebrated hours. Those details matter because they're universal. You don't have to understand basketball to understand ambition. You don't need to follow the WNBA to relate to the feeling of giving something up for something greater. That's why her narrative resonates outside sports. Parents see discipline. Kids see possibility. Adults see reminders of dreams they once chased. And unlike manufactured narratives, hers doesn't collapse under scrutiny. There are no contradictions. No persona gaps. What she says aligns with what she does. That alignment creates trust. And trust is the most valuable currency in marketing. Trait 3, cultural replication. This is the rarest element of all. When Caitlin Clark does something, people don't just watch it. They recreate it. They mimic her shots. They remix her moments. They turn her reactions into edits, trends, and references. That behavior can't be bought. Brands spend billions trying to spark that kind of organic replication. They hire consultants. They chase algorithms. They manufacture viral moments. And almost all of it fails. Because cultural replication only happens when people feel ownership. Caitlin Clark's fans don't feel like they're consuming her brand. They feel like they're participating in it. That's the difference between attention and adoption. And when those three traits converge, camera gravity, emotional narrative, and cultural replication, something extraordinary happens. The athlete stops being a product. They become a platform. That's what brands recognized. That's why every deal felt different. That's why every partnership escalated. That's why no one could replace her once she entered the conversation. And when you look at the results, the proof becomes undeniable. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just break expectations. She broke records, quietly, methodically, and permanently. And those records forced the entire industry to admit what had happened. This wasn't a moment. It was a transformation. At a certain point, skepticism disappears. Debate fades. Doubt quiets down. Because numbers don't care about opinions. And when you line up what Caitlin Clark accomplished in the marketing world before she ever played a professional game, the scale of it becomes almost uncomfortable to look at. Not because it's impressive, but because it forces a question no one in sports marketing wanted to answer yet. Why hadn't this happened sooner? Let's be clear about what Caitlin Clark actually did. Not hypothetically. Not symbolically. In reality, she became the first NCAA athlete, male or female, to appear in a national State Farm commercial. That alone should have been impossible. State Farm didn't lack options. They had access to Super Bowl MVPs, global icons, championship winners across every major sport. And yet, when the moment came to break new ground in the nil era, they chose a college athlete. That decision wasn't just bold. It was a referendum. It said that cultural relevance mattered more than professional credentials. That connection outweighed legacy. That trust beat tradition. Then came Nike. After 27 years of silence, Nike returned to the Super Bowl. Not with a veteran legend, not with a global megastar, but with Caitlin Clark as the emotional anchor. That wasn't just a commercial placement. That was Nike staking its reputation on a belief. They were saying publicly that this athlete represented the future of sports culture. That her story was strong enough to carry the weight of the biggest advertising stage on earth. And she did. She didn't just hold attention, she deepened it. Viewers didn't remember the ad because it was loud. They remembered it because it felt honest. Then Wilson changed the definition of partnership altogether. Caitlin Clark became the first female athlete ever to co-design a signature collection with the official basketball brand of the NBA and WNBA. That's not branding. That's authority. Wilson didn't just put her name on a product. They invited her into the process. They acknowledged her understanding of the game as something worth embedding into equipment used at the highest level. That move quietly dismantled decades of assumptions about who gets to shape the sport. And then there was Gatorade. Instead of a standard endorsement, Caitlin Clark became the first Gatorade athlete to launch a recovery-focused product built around her personal training methods. Not a generic bottle. Not a mass-produced prop. A product designed from her habits outward. And it sold out almost immediately. That's the part people gloss over. Because selling out isn't about fandom. It's about trust. Fans believed that what Caitlin Clark used mattered. That her routines were worth adopting. That her discipline translated into something tangible. Each one of these achievements alone would define a career. Together, they form something much bigger. They represent structural change. Every single deal required a company to break a rule they had followed for decades. Every partnership forced executives to take risks they'd previously avoided. Every success validated the idea that women's sports weren't underperforming, they were underinvested. Caitlin Clark didn't just benefit from the system. She exposed its limitations. And the ripple effects started immediately. Marketing meetings shifted. Nil strategies were rewritten. Brands that once hesitated suddenly felt behind. The question was no longer if women's basketball could deliver returns. The question became, how fast can we catch up? Because Caitlin Clark had done something irreversible. She proved that investing in women's sports wasn't a gesture. It wasn't charity. It wasn't optics. It was smart business. And once that truth hit balance sheets, there was no going back. But here's the part that truly unsettled the industry. This wasn't the peak. This wasn't the ceiling. This was the baseline. Because Caitlin Clark hadn't even played her first WNBA game yet. And if she could force this level of transformation before stepping onto a professional court, the implications were staggering. For the league. For brands. For every athlete watching from the sidelines. The system had changed. And now everyone was asking the same question, quietly, urgently, and with more than a little fear. What happens next? Once the dust settled, one truth became impossible to avoid. Caitlin Clark didn't just change how brands view one athlete. She changed how they view women's basketball as a market. For decades, companies treated women's sports like a side project. Something nice to support, but not something to bet real money on. Investments were cautious. Campaigns were limited. Expectations were capped. Caitlin Clark shattered that ceiling without asking permission. Because when brands looked at her results, they couldn't explain them away as hype. The numbers held. The engagement stuck. The products sold. The attention sustained. And suddenly, the conversation inside boardrooms sounded very different. Executives stopped asking, "Is women's basketball worth it?" They started asking, "Who's the next Caitlin Clark?" That shift matters. Because it changes how money moves. It changes who gets opportunities. It changes which athletes get developed, marketed, and trusted early instead of late. Caitlin Clark became a proof of concept. She showed that the audience was already there. That the hunger for connection, authenticity, and excellence in women's sports had been underestimated, not absent. And once that realization took hold, it spread fast. Brands outside traditional sports started paying attention. Technology companies saw innovation. Financial institutions saw discipline and trust. Media companies saw storytelling power. This wasn't about basketball anymore. Caitlin Clark had become a cultural bridge. A way for brands to connect with a generation that doesn't respond to traditional advertising. A generation that values transparency over polish, substance over slogans, and people over corporations. That's why her future extends far beyond sneakers and sports drinks. Documentaries, streaming projects, lifestyle partnerships, media ventures. The ceiling people assumed existed simply wasn't there. And for the WNBA, the implications were massive. Caitlin Clark didn't wait for the league to define her value. She arrived with leverage already built. She forced visibility. She forced conversation. She forced investment. She made it clear that star power in women's basketball doesn't need to be developed slowly. It needs to be recognized early. That changes everything for the athletes coming next. They won't have to beg brands to believe. They won't have to accept crumbs disguised as opportunities. They'll be able to point to Caitlin Clark and say, "This works." And that's how industries change. Not through permission, not through gradual approval, but through undeniable results. Before Caitlin Clark ever stepped onto a WNBA court, she had already done something no one expected. She beat the system at its own game. She didn't wait to be crowned. She didn't wait to be validated. She didn't wait for the industry to catch up. She built belief first and forced everyone else to follow. Brands didn't take chances on her because they were being generous. They did it because they were being strategic. They saw something undeniable forming and understood that waiting was the riskiest move of all. Caitlin Clark didn't just represent the future of women's basketball. She accelerated it. And the most unsettling part for her competitors? She's just getting started. Because when an athlete proves they can dominate culture before dominating a professional league, the playbook breaks. There is no ceiling. There is no lane. There is no script left to follow. Only momentum. And if you want to stay ahead of where basketball, culture, and influence are headed next, not after the headlines, but before they happen, make sure you're subscribed. Because stories like this aren't slowing down. They're multiplying.